The wine hit Grace's face just as she was telling Claire about feeling the baby kick. Grace Charlotte Morrison sat in the plush burgundy booth of Morrison's Steakhouse, her 7-month pregnant belly creating a gentle curve beneath her favorite navy maternity dress. The soft lighting cast a warm glow across the mahogany tables, and the gentle clink of crystal glasses filled the air with sophisticated ambiance. She had chosen this restaurant specifically for tonight's celebration, not because it was the city's most exclusive dining establishment, but because it held a special place in her family's history. Mom always said this was where she and Dad had their first date, Grace told her best friend Claire Elizabeth Santos, who sat across from her, sipping a glass of the restaurant's finest Chardonnay. Can you imagine 28 years ago, they sat in one of these very booths, probably nervous and excited about their future together. Claire smiled warmly, her dark eyes sparkling with affection for her friend. At 29, Claire had been Grace's anchor through every major life event: college graduation, her wedding to Richard, and now this pregnancy that had brought such joy after 2 years of trying. It's perfect that we're here tonight, Claire said, raising her glass. 7 months along, healthy baby, and you're absolutely glowing. This little celebration is well-deserved. Grace placed both hands on her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of movement beneath her palms. She's been so active today. I swear she knows we're somewhere special. She paused, her expression growing wistful. I just wish Dad could see this. 5 years is too long for a family feud, especially when there's going to be a grandchild. The estrangement from Walter James Morrison had been one of the most painful experiences of Grace's adult life. Their bitter argument about her marriage to Richard Clayton Hayes had created a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Walter had questioned Richard's character from the beginning, warning Grace about marrying a man whose wealth seemed to matter more than his integrity. The fight had escalated when Walter refused to attend their wedding, calling Richard a millionaire husband who thinks money can buy everything, including my daughter's happiness. Maybe the baby will be the bridge, Claire suggested gently. Grandchildren have a way of healing old wounds. Grace nodded, though uncertainty clouded her features. She had no idea that Walter Morrison now owned the very restaurant where they sat. Having purchased Morrison's Steakhouse 6 months ago as both a business investment and a sentimental tribute to his lost love with Dorothy, the original owner had been eager to sell to someone who would preserve the establishment's legacy and reputation. Richard promised he'd be home early tonight, Grace said, checking her phone for messages. He's been working such long hours on that new development project. I know being a millionaire husband comes with responsibilities, but sometimes I feel like I'm preparing for this baby alone. Claire reached across the table and squeezed Grace's hand. You're not alone. You have me, your mother, and Richard will come around once the baby arrives. Some men just need time to adjust to the idea of fatherhood. The server approached their table, a young woman with bright eyes and professional demeanor. Ladies, are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes? We're still waiting for my husband, Grace replied. He should be here any moment. As the server moved away, Grace felt another strong kick from the baby. She gasped softly, placing her hand on the spot where tiny feet seemed to be testing the boundaries of her womb. There she goes again, Grace laughed. I think she's going to be a soccer player. Claire leaned forward with excitement. Can I feel? Grace guided Claire's hand to the active spot on her belly. Almost immediately, another kick pressed against Claire's palm, causing both women to burst into delighted laughter. That's incredible, Claire whispered. She's really in there. Isn't she a whole little person just waiting to meet the world? The nursery is almost finished, Grace said, her voice filled with maternal pride. Richard hired the most expensive decorator in the city. Everything is perfect, from the custom crib to the hand-painted murals on the walls. Sometimes I just sit in there and imagine what it will be like when she finally arrives. The restaurant's atmosphere wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the cream-colored walls, while the soft murmur of conversation created an intimate backdrop for their celebration. Grace had dreamed of this moment, sharing her pregnancy joy in a place that held such family significance, even if her father wasn't there to witness it. I keep thinking about names, Grace continued. Richard wants something traditional, maybe Elizabeth or Catherine, but I've been drawn to Charlotte. It feels strong and timeless. Charlotte Morrison Hayes. Claire tested the name. I love it. It has such a beautiful sound. Grace nodded. though she noticed Claire's slight hesitation when saying Richard's name. Her best friend had never explicitly criticized her millionaire husband, but Grace sensed underlying concerns that Claire was too loyal to voice directly. "You don't have to pretend you like him," Grace said quietly. "I know you think I could have done better." Claire's expression grew careful. "I think you deserve someone who prioritizes you and your happiness above everything else. That's all any best friend wants for someone she loves." Before Grace could respond, her attention was caught by movement across the restaurant. A familiar figure was being seated at a corner table, partially hidden by an ornate pillar. Her heart skipped when she recognized the expensive suit and confident posture. "Is that Richard?" she asked Claire, squinting slightly to get a better view. Claire followed Grace's gaze, her expression immediately shifting to concern. "Grace, what? What is it?" Grace leaned forward, trying to see around the pillar more clearly. That's when she saw her, a stunning blonde woman in a form-fitting red dress, laughing intimately at something Richard was saying. The woman's hand rested casually on Richard's arm, and her body language spoke of familiarity that went far beyond business dinner conversation. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the woman from Richard's office Christmas party, Amber Sterling, who managed one of the boutique shops in Richard's commercial development. At the time, Richard had introduced her as one of our most successful tenants, but the way Amber had looked at him that night had made Grace uncomfortable. "Maybe it's just business," Claire said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. Grace watched as Richard leaned closer to Amber, his hand moving to rest on her thigh beneath the white tablecloth. The gesture was possessive, intimate, and completely inappropriate for any business relationship. The baby seemed to sense Grace's distress, moving restlessly in her womb as her heart rate increased. 7 months of pregnancy hormones combined with the shock of discovery created a perfect storm of emotional intensity. "Oh God," Grace whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "Oh God, Claire, he's with her. He's actually with her." Claire immediately moved to Grace's side of the booth, wrapping a protective arm around her friend's shoulders. "We don't know what this is. There could be an explanation." But even as Claire spoke the words, they both watched Richard lift Amber's hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles while gazing into her eyes with an expression Grace hadn't seen directed at her in months. The restaurant around them continued its elegant dance of service and conversation. Oblivious to the domestic drama unfolding in booth number 7, Grace felt as though she was watching her marriage dissolve in slow motion. Each intimate gesture between her millionaire husband and his beautiful companion, another nail in the coffin of her dreams. "What am I going to do?" Grace asked, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm 7 months pregnant. Claire, 7 months. How could he do this to us?" The baby kicked again, strong and insistent, as if responding to her mother's emotional turmoil. Grace looked down at her belly, realizing that her child's first introduction to family drama was happening before birth. Grace's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, her eyes never leaving the intimate scene unfolding across the restaurant. Richard's behavior with Amber Sterling was becoming increasingly obvious, the way he leaned into her personal space, how his fingers traced patterns on her wrist, the private smiles they shared that excluded the rest of the world. "I have to talk to him," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't just sit here and watch this happen." Claire gripped her friend's arm gently but firmly. "Grace, you're 7 months pregnant. Your blood pressure, your stress levels, think about the baby." "I am thinking about the baby," Grace replied, her voice gaining strength. "I'm thinking about what kind of father abandons his pregnant wife for dinner with his mistress. I'm thinking about what kind of marriage I'm bringing this child into." The restaurant's soft lighting suddenly felt harsh and exposing. Grace became acutely aware of other diners who might recognize her, might witness whatever was about to unfold. As the wife of millionaire husband Richard Hayes, her life had always been somewhat public in their social circles. The thought of humiliation in such a visible setting made her stomach clench. "If you're going over there, I'm coming with you," Claire declared, sliding out of the booth. Grace struggled to stand gracefully, her pregnant belly making quick movements impossible. The navy maternity dress that had made her feel beautiful and confident now felt like a beacon announcing her vulnerability. She smoothed the fabric over her bump, took a deep breath, and began walking across the restaurant floor. Each step felt like a lifetime. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps, but Grace felt as though every eye in the restaurant was following her approach. Richard had his back to her, completely absorbed in his conversation with Amber. Unaware that his pregnant wife was approaching their table, Amber saw her first. The blonde woman's expression shifted from sultry amusement to shock, then quickly to something that looked almost like satisfaction. She whispered something to Richard, who turned in his chair and went pale when he saw Grace standing behind him. "Hello, Richard," Grace said, her voice steady despite the emotional hurricane raging inside her. "Fancy meeting you here." Richard's composure cracked for just a moment before his businessman's mask slipped back into place. "Grace, what are you doing here? I thought you were having dinner with Claire." "I am having dinner with Claire," Grace replied, gesturing toward their booth where Claire stood watching anxiously. "The question is, what are you doing here? I thought you were working late at the office." Amber leaned back in her chair, studying Grace with calculating eyes. She was even more beautiful up close than Grace remembered: porcelain skin, perfect makeup, the kind of effortless glamour that came with youth and disposable income. Everything about her screamed availability and confidence. "This is a business dinner," Richard said, though his explanation sounded rehearsed. "Amber and I were discussing her lease renewal and expansion plans for the boutique." Grace looked pointedly at Richard's hand, which was still resting possessively on Amber's thigh. "Is physical contact part of all your business negotiations, or just the ones with attractive female tenants?" Richard jerked his hand away as if burned, but the damage was already done. Amber's slight smile suggested she was enjoying the confrontation, as though Grace's discovery was a game she had been waiting to play. "You're being dramatic," Richard said, his voice taking on the condescending tone Grace had grown to hate. "You know how important this development project is. Amber is one of our most successful tenants." "I'm sure she is," Grace replied, her hand moving protectively to her belly. "Tell me, Richard, does our unborn daughter factor into your important business decisions at all?" The mention of the baby seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and Grace saw something that might have been guilt or regret flash across his features. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Of course she does," Richard said. "Everything I do is for our family's future." Amber chose that moment to speak for the first time, her voice honey-sweet with an underlying edge of steel. "Richard has told me so much about his domestic situation. It sounds quite complicated." The word domestic was delivered with subtle disdain, as though Grace's pregnancy and their marriage were inconvenient obstacles rather than sacred commitments. Grace felt heat rising in her cheeks, partially from embarrassment and partially from anger. "Complicated," Grace repeated. "Is that what we're calling a marriage and pregnancy now? A complication?" Other diners were beginning to notice the tension at the corner table. Grace caught glimpses of curious faces turning in their direction, whispered conversations pausing mid-sentence. The exclusive restaurant's atmosphere of refined discretion was being disrupted by what was clearly becoming a domestic dispute. Richard seemed to realize they were attracting attention. "Grace, you're making a scene. This is neither the time nor the place for this conversation." "When would be the appropriate time?" Grace asked, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. "When you're at the office with her, when you're traveling for business. When exactly should a pregnant wife discuss her husband's affair?" "Affair?" Richard's voice sharpened. "That's a serious accusation. Grace, you're being paranoid and hormonal." The word hormonal was like gasoline on fire. Grace felt 7 months of accumulated frustrations: the late nights, the missed appointments, the growing distance between them crystallized into white-hot anger. "Hormonal," she repeated, her voice carrying across the restaurant despite her best efforts to keep it low. "I'm hormonal for questioning why my millionaire husband is having intimate dinners with beautiful women while his pregnant wife eats alone." Amber's smile widened, as though she was enjoying the show. She placed her hand deliberately on Richard's arm, a gesture of possession and territorial marking that wasn't lost on Grace. "Richard," Amber said, her voice soft but clearly audible. "Maybe you should tell her." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Grace felt the baby move restlessly in her womb, responding to her elevated stress levels. Claire appeared at her side, a protective presence that gave Grace strength. "Tell me what," Grace asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Richard looked between the two women, his pregnant wife with her swollen belly and tired eyes, and his young, beautiful mistress with her perfect figure and predatory smile. In that moment, Grace saw her husband make a choice that would change everything. "Grace," Richard said, his voice taking on a cold, distant quality she had never heard before. "We need to discuss some things, but not here, not like this." "No," Grace said firmly. "Here, now. Tell me what she thinks I need to know." Amber leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "He doesn't love you anymore. Grace. Hasn't for months. You're just too wrapped up in playing house to notice." The words hit Grace like physical blows. Around them, the restaurant had gone noticeably quieter. Other diners straining to hear the drama unfolding at table 12. Grace felt exposed, humiliated, and utterly alone despite Claire's supportive presence beside her. Richard didn't deny Amber's words. His silence was confirmation enough. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Grace stared at her millionaire husband, waiting for him to contradict Amber's cruel declaration, to defend their marriage, to show some trace of the man she had fallen in love with 4 years ago. Instead, Richard looked away, his jaw set in the stubborn expression she knew meant he had made up his mind about something. "Richard," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly, "tell her she's wrong. Tell her about our baby, about our plans, about the nursery we decorated together." Amber laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "Oh, sweetie, he told me about the nursery, how you insisted on that expensive decorator, how you spent hours obsessing over every detail while he worked to pay for it all. He called it Grace's little project." Each word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Grace felt the baby kick frantically, as though responding to her mother's distress. Her hand moved protectively to her belly, and she realized that her child was experiencing this trauma along with her. "That's not true," Grace whispered. But even as she said it, she remembered Richard's increasing absence during the nursery planning, his distracted responses when she showed him paint samples and furniture catalogs. "Isn't it?" Amber continued, emboldened by Grace's obvious pain. "When was the last time he touched you? Really touched you? Not just polite husband maintenance. When was the last time he looked at you the way he looks at me?" Claire stepped closer to Grace, radiating protective energy. "That's enough," she said firmly. "Whatever issues you people have, this isn't the way to resolve them." Amber turned her predatory smile toward Claire. "And you must be the loyal best friend, always ready to defend poor, delusional Grace. Tell me, don't you get tired of watching her cling to a man who clearly doesn't want her anymore?" "Stop," Richard said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. He seemed more concerned about the scene they were creating than about defending his pregnant wife from his mistress's attacks. Grace looked around the restaurant and realized that their confrontation had become the evening's entertainment. Phones were being discreetly raised, undoubtedly recording video that would be online within hours. The thought of her humiliation being broadcast across social media made her feel sick. "I need to sit down," Grace said, reaching for a nearby chair. The combination of pregnancy, stress, and public embarrassment was making her dizzy. "No," Amber said, standing up from her chair with fluid grace. "What you need to do is accept reality. Richard doesn't want to be married to you anymore. He doesn't want to pretend to be excited about a baby he never really wanted. He wants to be with someone who understands him, someone who doesn't trap him with pregnancy and domestic demands." The cruelty of the words was breathtaking. Grace felt as though she had been physically slapped. Around them, the restaurant had gone completely silent, every diner straining to hear the domestic drama unfolding in their midst. "You don't know anything about our marriage," Grace said, finding her voice despite the emotional assault. "You don't know what we've built together, what we mean to each other. I know he comes to my apartment every Tuesday and Thursday," Amber replied matter-of-factly. "I know he keeps clothes in my closet and has a key to my door. I know he tells me things he doesn't tell you, like how tired he is of pretending to be happy about a pregnancy that was your idea, not his." Grace felt the world tilting around her. Tuesday and Thursday were the nights Richard claimed to work late at the office, the nights she spent alone, preparing dinner that went uneaten, watching movies by herself while her millionaire husband was apparently building a second life with his beautiful mistress. "Richard," Grace said, turning to her husband with desperate hope. Tell her she's lying. Tell her you want our baby, that you love our life together. Richard looked at his pregnant wife, really looked at her for the first time since she had approached their table. Grace saw something flicker in his eyes, some trace of the man who had proposed to her on a beach in Maui, who had cried when she told him about the pregnancy, who had spent an entire weekend painting the nursery walls. But then Amber placed her hand on his shoulder, and the moment passed. Grace, Richard said quietly, you're embarrassing yourself. This isn't the place for this kind of scene. The betrayal in those words was complete. After everything, the affair, the lies, the public humiliation, he was criticizing her for making a scene. Grace felt something fundamental break inside her chest, some last vestige of hope that their marriage could be salvaged. Embarrassing myself, Grace repeated, her voice growing stronger with anger. I'm embarrassing myself by confronting my cheating husband and his mistress, by defending my marriage and my unborn child. You're being hysterical, Richard said, and Grace realized he was more concerned about the other diners' opinions than about her feelings. People are staring. That's when Amber struck. Good, the blonde woman said, reaching for her wine glass. Let them stare. Let them see what happens when women don't know when to give up gracefully. Before anyone could react, Amber threw the contents of her full wine glass directly into Grace's face. The red liquid hit her with shocking coldness, soaking her hair, streaming down her cheeks, and staining the front of her navy maternity dress. The wine's deep crimson color looked like blood against the dark fabric. The restaurant erupted in gasps and shocked exclamations. Grace stood frozen, wine dripping from her chin, her carefully styled hair now a sodden mess. The expensive maternity dress that had made her feel beautiful was ruined, clinging to her pregnant body in wet, wine-stained patches. Accept reality, Grace, Amber said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. He doesn't love you anymore. Stop clinging to a man who's moved on. Grace felt the baby moving frantically in her womb, responding to her mother's elevated heart rate and stress hormones. The child she carried was experiencing this trauma along with her, and that realization filled Grace with protective rage that transcended her own humiliation. You threw wine on a pregnant woman, Grace said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent restaurant. In front of all these people, you threw wine on a pregnant woman. I threw wine on a woman who doesn't know when she's beaten, Amber replied without remorse. Pregnancy doesn't make you special, Grace. It just makes you inconvenient. Multiple phones were now openly recording the incident. Grace realized that within hours, video of her humiliation would be circulating online, the pregnant wife publicly assaulted by her husband's mistress while he did nothing to defend her. Claire immediately stepped forward with napkins, trying to help Grace clean the wine from her face and hair. You're insane, she told Amber. Absolutely insane. Richard sat in his chair, looking stunned by the escalation but making no move to help his pregnant wife or condemn his mistress's actions. His paralysis was almost worse than Amber's attack. That's when a new voice cut through the chaos. What exactly is happening at this table? The voice was calm, authoritative, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Grace looked up through wine-blurred vision to see a tall man in impeccable chef's whites approaching their table. His hair was silver at the temples, his face weathered but distinguished, and his eyes blazed with carefully controlled anger. It took Grace a moment to recognize him through her shock and the wine stinging her eyes. When she did, her world shifted once again. Dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Walter James Morrison, owner of Morrison's Steakhouse, stood before them like an avenging angel in chef's whites. He had emerged from the kitchen after hearing the commotion, expecting to handle a typical restaurant dispute. Instead, he found his estranged daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 5 years, standing wine-soaked and humiliated while her millionaire husband sat passively by. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous. Walter's professional composure cracked as he took in the sight of his pregnant daughter, wine-stained and trembling, surrounded by the wreckage of her marriage in his restaurant. Grace, he said, his voice softer now, filled with a father's protective fury. What did they do to you? Walter James Morrison had built his restaurant empire on the principle that dignity mattered more than profit. In 25 years of hospitality management, He had seen every kind of human drama play out across dining room tables, business deals gone wrong, relationships ending, families fracturing, but nothing had prepared him to find his own estranged daughter standing wine-soaked and pregnant in the middle of his establishment, while her millionaire husband sat motionless in his chair. The recognition process was surreal and painful. Grace, with wine dripping from her hair and staining her maternity dress, looked exactly like her mother had during her own pregnancy 30 years earlier. Walter felt 25 years of protective instincts surge through him as he took in the scene his daughter humiliated, her unborn grandchild put at risk by stress, and two people who clearly didn't deserve to breathe the same air as his family. "Grace," he said again, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "Tell me what happened here." Grace's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the wine. Seeing her father after 5 years of estrangement, especially in this moment of complete vulnerability, overwhelmed her already fragile emotional state. "Dad, I didn't know you owned this place," she whispered, accepting the clean towel that appeared in Walter's outstretched hand. "I came here because this is where you and Mom had your first date. I thought it would be good luck for the baby." Walter's expression softened for a moment as he helped his daughter wipe wine from her face. "I bought it 6 months ago," he said gently. "I thought about calling you, telling you about it, but I was too stubborn to answer," Grace finished, understanding flooding her features. The tender moment was interrupted by Richard, who finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of the situation unfolding around him. "You're Walter Morrison, the Walter Morrison, who owns half the restaurants in the city." Walter's attention turned to his son-in-law with the intensity of a laser beam. "I'm Walter Morrison, who owns this restaurant, where my pregnant daughter has just been assaulted while her husband sat and watched." "It wasn't assault," Amber interjected, apparently oblivious to the shift in power dynamics at the table. "It was wine. No one was hurt." Walter looked at Amber with the kind of attention a scientist might give to an interesting but unpleasant specimen. "You threw wine at a pregnant woman in my restaurant, and you don't think anyone was hurt?" "She was being dramatic," Amber said, lifting her chin defiantly, making a scene over something that's really none of her business anymore. The audacity of the statement left Walter momentarily speechless. Around them, the restaurant staff had begun to gather at a respectful distance, recognizing their employer's protective stance and ready to act on his orders. "None of her business," Walter repeated slowly. "The marriage and pregnancy are none of the wife's business." Richard finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than his usual confident businessman's tone. "Mr. Morrison, this is a private matter between my wife and me. I'm sure we can work this out without involving restaurant management." Walter turned his full attention to Richard, and Grace saw her father transform from concerned parent to business predator in the space of a heartbeat. This was the Walter Morrison who had built an empire from nothing, who commanded respect from city councilmen and corporation executives alike. "Private matter," Walter said, his voice dangerously quiet. "In my restaurant with my pregnant daughter wearing wine like a badge of shame, while you sit there like a statue." Claire, who had been silently supporting Grace throughout the confrontation, spoke up for the first time since Walter's arrival. "Mr. Morrison, Grace needs to sit down. The stress isn't good for the baby." Walter immediately signaled to his staff, and within seconds a chair appeared for Grace. She sank into it gratefully, one hand on her belly where the baby was still moving restlessly. "How far along are you?" Walter asked, his voice gentle again as he focused on his daughter. 7 months, Grace replied. "It's a girl. We're naming her Charlotte." "Sir." Walter's eyes brightened at the news, and for a moment the family resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable. "Charlotte Morrison Hayes," he said, testing the name. "She'll be beautiful, just like her mother." "Actually," Amber said, apparently determined to insert herself back into the conversation, "that's assuming the marriage lasts long enough for the baby to be born into it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Walter's attention returned to Amber with renewed focus, and Grace saw something in her father's expression that reminded her why he had been so successful in business. Walter Morrison didn't just succeed, he eliminated obstacles. "I'm sorry," Walter said to Amber, his voice perfectly polite and therefore terrifying. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "You are, Amber Sterling, she replied, apparently mistaking his politeness for friendliness. I manage one of the boutique shops in Richard's development. Ah, Walter said, nodding as though this explained everything. You work for my son-in-law. Well, technically I lease space from his company, Amber corrected, but we have a very close working relationship. I'm sure you do, Walter replied. Close enough that you felt comfortable throwing wine at his pregnant wife in a public restaurant? For the first time since the confrontation began, Amber seemed to realize that the situation might not be proceeding in her favor. She looked to Richard for support, but he was staring at Walter with growing comprehension of just how badly he had miscalculated. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, which he handed to Richard. My card, he said simply. I think you'll find my contact information very interesting. Richard looked at the card and paled visibly. Walter Morrison's business empire extended far beyond restaurants. He owned hotels, catering companies, event venues, and had partnerships with every major hospitality business in the city. Being Walter Morrison's son-in-law had been a potential advantage that Richard had thrown away through his affair and his passive acceptance of his mistress's abuse. Mr. Morrison, Richard said, his voice taking on the tone he used when trying to salvage failing business deals. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. The only misunderstanding, Walter replied, is how a man married to my daughter could sit motionless while she's publicly humiliated. But that's about to be corrected. Walter turned to face the restaurant, where every diner and staff member was watching the unfolding drama with rapt attention. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Ladies and gentlemen, Walter announced, I apologize for the disturbance to your evening. However, I want you all to witness something important. The woman sitting here covered in wine is my daughter, Grace. She is 7 months pregnant with my first grandchild. The woman who threw wine at her and the man who allowed it to happen are no longer welcome in my establishment. A murmur rippled through the restaurant as diners absorbed this information. Several people were still recording with their phones, capturing not just the original incident, but Walter's response to it. Furthermore, Walter continued, I want everyone to know that this incident has been recorded by our security cameras from multiple angles. The footage will be available to anyone who needs it, media, legal authorities, or social media platforms. Grace looked up at her father with a mixture of love, gratitude, and amazement. In 5 minutes, Walter had accomplished what she couldn't do in 5 years of marriage. He had made Richard face consequences for his actions. Amber finally seemed to understand that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. You can't ban us from a public restaurant, she said, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Walter smiled, and Grace remembered that expression from her childhood. It was the smile he wore when explaining to her why certain rules existed and what happened to people who broke them. Miss Sterling, Walter said, this is a private establishment, and I can ban anyone I choose. But don't worry, you won't just be banned from Morrison's Steakhouse. You'll be banned from every restaurant I own, every restaurant my friends own, and every establishment in this city that values my business relationships. Richard stood up abruptly, finally grasping the full implications of the situation. Walter, surely we can discuss this reasonably. As businessmen, Walter repeated. Richard, you just lost the right to call yourself a businessman. A businessman understands consequences. A businessman protects his investments. A businessman doesn't sit silently while his pregnant wife is assaulted in the city's most exclusive restaurant. Grace felt the baby calm down as her own stress levels began to decrease. For the first time in months, someone was fighting for her, protecting her, treating her like she mattered. The relief was almost overwhelming. Dad, she said softly. Thank you. Walter knelt beside her chair, his chef's whites pristine despite the chaos of the evening. Grace, I should have called you months ago. I should have swallowed my pride and been there for you during this pregnancy. I'm sorry. I should have called you too, Grace replied, tears flowing freely now. I was just so hurt and too proud to admit that maybe you were right about. She glanced at Richard, who was standing frozen by his chair. We'll talk about all of that later, Walter said gently. Right now, let's get you cleaned up and make sure you and my granddaughter are okay. As Walter helped Grace to her feet, preparing to escort her to a private dining room where she could recover from the evening's trauma. He turned back to Richard and Amber with an expression that could have frozen fire. "You have 10 minutes to finish your business dinner and leave my restaurant," he said. "After that, security will escort you out. And Richard, I suggest you think very carefully about how you want the situation to proceed, because your business reputation in this city now depends entirely on how you treat my pregnant daughter." The threat was delivered with quiet authority, but everyone in the restaurant understood its implications. Walter Morrison didn't just own restaurants, he owned influence, connections, and the power to make or break careers in their social and business circles. Walter Morrison had not built his hospitality empire by making idle threats. As he helped his wine-stained daughter toward the restaurant's private dining room, his mind was already calculating the most effective way to protect her and ensure that the people who had humiliated her faced appropriate consequences. 25 years in business had taught him that swift, decisive action was always more effective than delayed revenge. "Marcus," he called to his head of security, a former police detective who had worked for Walter for 8 years. "I need the security footage from cameras 3, 7, and 12 copied and saved to multiple drives. Everything from 8:30 onward." "Already on it, sir," Marcus replied, having anticipated his employer's needs. "Full incident captured from 3 angles. Perfect audio quality. Should I contact our legal team?" "Not yet," Walter said, helping Grace settle into a plush chair in the restaurant's executive dining room. "But have them on standby." Grace looked up at her father with wonder and gratitude. "Dad, you don't have to do all this. I just need to figure out what to do next." "What you need to do next is rest and take care of my granddaughter," Walter replied firmly. "What I need to do is remind certain people that actions have consequences." Claire had followed them into the private room, carrying Grace's purse and the ruined shawl that had been draped over her shoulders. "Mr. Morrison, should I call Grace's doctor? The stress level tonight has been extreme." "Good thinking," Walter approved. "Grace, how are you feeling? Any cramping, dizziness, unusual pain?" Grace considered the question carefully, placing both hands on her belly to assess the baby's condition. "She's calmed down significantly since we came in here. I think she was responding to my stress hormones, but she seems okay now." "We'll have the doctor check you anyway," Walter decided. Better safe than sorry. Through the private dining room's windows, they could see Richard and Amber still at their table in the main restaurant. Richard appeared to be having an intense conversation on his phone, while Amber sat stiffly in her chair, finally understanding that the evening had not gone according to plan. Walter excused himself for a moment, stepping into the hallway to make a series of phone calls. Grace could hear fragments of his conversations, brief, professional exchanges that suggested he was activating a network of business relationships. "Yes, this is Walter Morrison. I need to inform you about an incident at my restaurant tonight. Banned permanently. Yes. I'll send you the security footage. Spread the word through your network." When Walter returned to the private dining room, his expression was grimly satisfied. Richard and his friend will find their social options significantly limited going forward. "What did you do?" Grace asked, though part of her was afraid to know the answer. "I made some phone calls," Walter replied simply. "Morrison's Steakhouse is where Richard brings all his major business clients. Correct, the place where he wines and dines investors and closes deals?" Grace nodded, remembering countless stories about important dinners that had secured funding for Richard's development projects. "Well," Walter continued, "he's now permanently banned from the restaurant where he's been conducting business for years, but that's just the beginning. I also called my friends who own the Continental Club, Riverside Manor, the Ambassador Hotel Restaurant, and about 15 other establishments where Richard is known to entertain clients." Claire's eyes widened as she grasped the implications. "You've banned him from every upscale restaurant in the city." "Not just banned," Walter clarified. "Blacklisted. There's a difference. When you're banned, it's just that one establishment. When you're blacklisted, it means every restaurant owner in the city knows why you're unwelcome, and they choose not to serve you based on your character rather than any specific incident at their venue." Grace felt a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction that Richard was facing consequences, but also concern about the far-reaching implications of her father's actions. "Dad, isn't this a bit extreme?" she asked carefully. Walter sat down across from his daughter, his expression serious but gentle. Grace, let me tell you what happened tonight from my perspective. I discovered that my pregnant daughter, whom I haven't seen in 5 years because of my own stubborn pride, was publicly humiliated by her husband's mistress while he sat and did nothing. In my restaurant, in front of dozens of witnesses. He paused, letting the weight of the situation settle between them. Now, I can respond to that in one of two ways, Walter continued. I can treat it as a private family matter and hope Richard develops a conscience. Or I can treat it as a public attack on my family that requires a public response. Which do you think is more likely to ensure that you and my granddaughter are protected going forward? Before Grace could answer, Marcus appeared in the doorway with a tablet in his hands. Mr. Morrison, you'll want to see this. The incident footage has already been posted online. Walter took the tablet and watched the video that was now circulating on social media. The quality was surprisingly good. Multiple angles captured everything from Grace's initial approach to Richard's table through Amber's wine-throwing assault. The audio was clear enough to hear Amber's cruel words and Richard's failure to defend his pregnant wife. How many views? Walter asked. It's been online for 20 minutes and already has over 50,000 views, Marcus reported. Multiple people in the restaurant posted their recordings simultaneously. The hashtag pregnant wine incident is starting to trend locally. Grace felt her stomach drop. Oh God, this is going to be everywhere, isn't it? Yes, Walter said matter-of-factly, which is why my response needs to be immediate and comprehensive. Public humiliation requires public justice. Grace, if I don't act decisively, people will think it's acceptable to treat my family this way. Walter's phone rang, and he answered with his characteristic directness. Morrison? Yes, I saw the video. No, that's my daughter. 7 months pregnant. Of course I'm taking action. Grace listened to her father's conversation and realized that the incident had already reached the highest levels of the city's business community. Walter's reputation meant that an attack on his family was being treated as an attack on him personally. That was David Chen, Walter explained after ending the call. He owns the premier event center where Richard was planning to host his investor dinner next week. The event has been canceled. Canceled, Grace repeated. Permanently, Walter confirmed. David doesn't want to be associated with someone who allows pregnant women to be assaulted while he sits passively by. Bad for business. Bad for reputation. Claire shook her head in amazement. Mr. Morrison, you've destroyed Richard's professional life in less than an hour. I've allowed Richard to destroy his own professional life, Walter corrected. I just made sure the consequences were immediate rather than delayed. A man who won't protect his pregnant wife can't be trusted to protect business interests either. Grace's phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. We need to talk. This has gone too far. She showed the message to her father, who read it with evident disgust. Now he wants to talk, Walter observed. After his wife was humiliated, after his business reputation started crumbling, now he thinks dialogue might be useful. Should I respond? Grace asked. That's entirely up to you, Walter replied. But I suggest you consider whether Richard is reaching out because he's genuinely remorseful or because he's just realized how much this incident is going to cost him. Before Grace could decide how to respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Richard's office number, which meant he was probably calling from the restaurant's bar area. Answer it, Walter suggested. Put it on speaker. I want to hear what my son-in-law has to say for himself. Grace accepted the call and activated the speaker function. Richard's voice filled the private dining room, tight with stress and barely controlled panic. Grace, we need to fix this situation immediately. The video is everywhere, and my business partners are already calling with concerns. This could destroy everything we've worked for. Grace noticed that Richard's primary concern was business damage rather than her welfare or their marriage. Even in crisis, his priorities revealed his true character. Hello, Richard, Grace said calmly. I'm here with Dad and Claire. You're on speaker. There was a pause as Richard absorbed this information. Walter, Richard said, his voice shifting to the tone he used for difficult business negotiations. I understand you're upset about tonight's incident, but surely we can reach some kind of accommodation. Businessmen should be able to work these things out reasonably. Walter's expression darkened at being addressed as though this were a commercial transaction. Richard, Walter replied, his voice deadly quiet, My pregnant daughter is sitting here with wine stains on her dress and tears in her eyes. Your business concerns are not my priority. Look, Richard continued, desperation creeping into his voice. Maybe I didn't handle the situation perfectly, but Grace caught me off guard. I was trying to avoid making a bigger scene. You avoided making a scene by allowing your mistress to assault your pregnant wife, Walter asked. That was your conflict resolution strategy. It wasn't assault, Richard protested. It was just wine. No one was seriously hurt. The casual dismissal of Grace's humiliation was apparently the final straw for Walter. Grace saw her father's expression shift from angry protectiveness to cold, calculated fury. Richard, Walter said, let me explain something to you. In the next 24 hours, you will discover exactly how many doors in this city open because of who I am and how many close when I withdraw my goodwill. You had one job tonight, protect your pregnant wife. You failed. Now face the consequences. Walter ended the call without waiting for Richard's response, then turned to his daughter with gentle concern. Grace, how are you feeling? Do you want to go home, or would you prefer to stay here tonight? I can have a suite prepared at the Morrison Hotel. For the first time since the wine hit her face, Grace smiled genuinely. Can I stay here tonight? She asked. I don't want to go back to our house and deal with Richard right now. I just want to be somewhere safe. You'll always be safe with me, Walter promised. You and Charlotte both. Within 2 hours of the wine-throwing incident, Walter Morrison's influence network had activated with the precision of a military operation. Grace sat in the luxury suite above Morrison's steakhouse, showered and changed into comfortable clothes that Claire had retrieved from her house, watching her father orchestrate a response that was both methodical and devastating. The mayor's office called, Walter announced, ending his latest phone conversation. They want to ensure that Morrison's Steakhouse continues to host their monthly business leadership breakfasts. Apparently, they heard about tonight's incident and wanted to express their support for my family. Grace looked up from the tablet where she had been watching the video of her humiliation spread across social media platforms. The incident had been picked up by local news outlets, and several national websites were beginning to feature the story as an example of millionaire husband privilege and domestic abuse. Dad, this is getting bigger than I expected, she said, showing him the latest coverage. Look at this headline, millionaire real estate developer silent as mistress attacks pregnant wife. Walter examined the coverage with professional interest. Good. Public accountability is exactly what this situation requires. Richard built his reputation on being a successful businessman and family man. If that reputation was false, it deserves to be corrected. Claire, who had been monitoring Grace's physical condition throughout the evening, looked up from taking her friend's blood pressure. Numbers are good, she reported. Baby seems calm, and Grace's stress levels are decreasing. Whatever you're doing, Mr. Morrison, it's working. I'm ensuring that my daughter and granddaughter are protected, Walter replied simply. But the night isn't over yet. As if summoned by his words, Marcus appeared in the doorway with an update. Sir, we have a situation developing downstairs. Vernon Sterling just arrived and is asking to speak with his daughter. He seems agitated. Grace's eyes widened. Amber's father is here. Apparently he drove down from Millerville after Amber called him crying. Marcus explained. He's asking about the video that's circulating online, and he doesn't seem pleased with what he's learned. Walter considered this development with interest. What kind of man is Vernon Sterling? Small-town mechanic, Marcus replied, consulting his phone where he had apparently been researching the Sterling family. Owns a garage in Millerville. Widower. Raised Amber alone after his wife died when she was 12. Local church deacon. Volunteer firefighter. Very different background from his daughter's current lifestyle. Bring him up, Walter decided. I'd like to meet the man who raised the woman who assaulted my pregnant daughter. While they waited for Vernon Sterling's arrival, Grace's phone continued buzzing with messages and missed calls. Richard had attempted to contact her 17 times in the past hour, with increasingly desperate voicemails that ranged from angry demands to business-focused negotiations to what sounded like genuine panic. Grace, Walter said gently, you don't have to listen to those messages tonight. Whatever Richard wants to say can wait until you're ready to hear it. I think I should listen to at least one, Grace replied. I need to understand what he's thinking, how he's processing all this. She selected the most recent voicemail and put it on speaker. Richard's voice filled the room, tight with stress and barely controlled desperation. Grace, you have to call me back. My investors are pulling out of the Harbor Point development. The Premier Event Center canceled our investor dinner. Morrison's was supposed to host the City Planning Committee meeting next month, and now they won't even take my calls. Your father is destroying my business over a personal disagreement? Grace exchanged glances with her father and Claire. Richard still didn't understand that this wasn't about business disagreements, it was about character and consequences. The voicemail continued. Look, maybe I made some mistakes tonight, but this nuclear response is completely disproportionate. Amber throwing wine was inappropriate, but it's not the end of the world. We can move past this if everyone just calms down and thinks rationally. Mistakes, Claire repeated with disgust. He's calling his affair and allowing his mistress to assault you. Mistakes. Some mistakes, Grace echoed, as if forgetting to pick up milk is equivalent to destroying our marriage. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Marcus entered with a man who was clearly out of place in the luxury hotel suite, but carried himself with the dignity of someone unashamed of his working-class background. Vernon Sterling was approximately 60 years old, wearing clean but worn jeans and a button-down shirt that had seen many washings. His hands showed the calluses and stains of honest mechanical work, and his expression carried the bewildered pain of a parent discovering that his child had acted shamefully. Mr. Morrison, Vernon said, extending his hand with straightforward courtesy. I'm Vernon Sterling. I understand my daughter caused some trouble here tonight. Walter shook Vernon's hand, immediately recognizing a man who operated by old-fashioned principles of accountability and respect. Mr. Sterling, Walter replied, your daughter threw wine at my pregnant daughter while her husband sat and watched. I'd call that more than trouble. Vernon's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. I saw the video. Multiple people sent it to me. I've never been so ashamed in my life. He turned to Grace, his expression filled with genuine remorse. Ma'am, I want to apologize for my daughter's behavior. What she did was inexcusable, and I raised her better than that. Grace was surprised by the sincerity of his apology, especially compared to Richard's self-serving voicemails. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I appreciate that. Where is Amber now? Walter asked. Downstairs in my truck, crying and carrying on about how everyone's being unfair to her. Vernon replied with evident disgust. She seems to think that because your son-in-law is rich, she had some kind of right to treat his pregnant wife however she pleased. Vernon's assessment of his daughter's behavior was harsh but accurate. Grace realized that Amber's cruelty wasn't just personal vindictiveness. It was entitlement born from believing that wealth and beauty gave her permission to hurt other people. Mr. Sterling, Walter said, I assume you didn't know about your daughter's relationship with my son-in-law. I knew she was dating someone she couldn't talk about, Vernon admitted. Someone complicated, she said. I figured it was some rich boy whose family wouldn't approve of a mechanic's daughter. I never imagined it was a married man with a pregnant wife. The pain in Vernon's voice was evident. Like Walter, he was a father dealing with the consequences of his child's choices. But unlike Richard, Vernon was taking responsibility and expressing genuine remorse. What are you planning to do? Claire asked gently. Vernon's expression hardened with paternal determination. I'm taking her home. Tonight, she's going to quit that boutique job, move back to Millerville, and remember who she really is. This big city lifestyle has made her forget her values. She's an adult, Grace pointed out. She can refuse to go with you. She can, Vernon agreed, but I pay for her apartment, her car, and most of her expenses. She wants to act like she's independent. She can learn what independence actually costs. Walter nodded approvingly. Financial consequences have a way of clarifying priorities. I also want to pay for cleaning that dress, Vernon continued, addressing Grace directly. And any medical expenses if the stress caused problems with your pregnancy. It's not enough to make up for what she did, but it's something. Grace was touched by Vernon's offer, especially since it came without legal pressure or business motivation. That's very kind, Mr. Sterling, but it's not necessary. It is necessary, Vernon insisted. My wife died when Amber was 12, and I'm afraid I spoiled her afterward, trying to make up for her not having a mother. I created a girl who thinks the world owes her whatever she wants, And tonight she took that attitude out on an innocent woman? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected visitor. Marcus appeared in the doorway again, this time with an expression of surprise rather than routine professional alertness. "Mr. Morrison," he announced. "Mrs. Maureen Hayes is here to see you. She says she's Grace's mother-in-law and needs to speak with the family urgently." Grace's eyes widened in shock. "Richard's mother is here. How did she even know what happened?" "Mrs. Hayes appears very well informed about the evening's events," Marcus replied diplomatically. Maureen Rose Hayes was a formidable woman who had never particularly liked Grace, viewing her as an unsuitable match for her successful son. Her arrival at Morrison's Steakhouse at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night suggested that the incident had reached even the highest levels of the Hayes family hierarchy. "Show her up," Walter decided. "This evening is apparently going to include representatives from all the affected families." As they waited for Maureen's arrival, Vernon Sterling made his excuses and prepared to leave with his daughter. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Hayes," he said formally. "Again, I apologize for my daughter's behavior. You won't have any more trouble from the Sterling family." He turned to Grace one final time. "Ma'am, I hope your baby is born healthy and happy. You deserve better than what you got tonight." After Vernon left, Grace reflected on the strange dynamics of the evening. Amber's father had shown more genuine concern for her welfare than her own husband had displayed. Richard's failure to protect her was becoming more obvious with each comparison to how other men her father. Vernon Sterling had responded to the situation. "Grace," Walter said gently, "are you prepared to face Maureen Hayes? She's never been your biggest supporter." "I know," Grace replied, straightening her shoulders with determination. "But maybe tonight will help her understand what kind of man her son really is." When Maureen Hayes entered the luxury suite, she carried herself with the imperious confidence of old money and social position. At 62, she remained elegant and intimidating, dressed in expensive clothes despite the late hour. But Grace noticed something different in her mother-in-law's expression, concern that seemed genuine rather than merely protective of family reputation. "Grace," Maureen said without preamble, "I saw the video. Are you all right? Is the baby all right?" The unexpected maternal concern in Maureen's voice surprised everyone in the room. Grace had been prepared for criticism or blame, not genuine worry about her welfare. "We're both okay," Grace replied carefully. "It was just very stressful and humiliating." Maureen's attention turned to Walter with newfound respect. "Mr. Morrison, I believe we have much to discuss about my son's behavior tonight." Maureen Rose Hayes had spent 38 years molding her son Richard into what she considered the perfect combination of business success and social respectability. She had overseen his education, guided his career choices, and approved his marriage to Grace as a suitable union that would produce acceptable grandchildren while maintaining the Hayes family's reputation in their elite social circles. But the video circulating across social media platforms showed her son failing catastrophically at the most basic requirement of manhood, protecting his pregnant wife from public assault. For Maureen, this wasn't just personal disappointment, it was a fundamental threat to everything the Hayes family represented. "Mr. Morrison," Maureen began, settling into one of the suite's elegant chairs with practiced grace. "I want you to know that Richard's behavior tonight does not represent the values I raised him with or the standards the Hayes family maintains." Walter studied his counterpart with interest. Maureen Hayes was exactly the kind of formidable matriarch he had expected to produce. Richard wealthy, influential, accustomed to controlling outcomes through social pressure and family authority. "Mrs. Hayes," Walter replied formally, "your son sat motionless while his pregnant wife was publicly humiliated. Those actions speak to his character more clearly than any family values." "I agree completely," Maureen said, surprising everyone in the room. "Which is why I'm here to discuss how we're going to correct the situation." Grace looked at her mother-in-law with confusion and suspicion. In 4 years of marriage, Maureen had never shown particular concern for Grace's welfare, viewing her as adequate but not ideal wife material for her precious son. "What exactly are you proposing to do?" Grace asked carefully. Maureen's expression hardened with maternal determination. "I'm proposing to save my son from his own stupidity before he destroys not just his marriage, but his business, his reputation, and any hope of a relationship with his child. She turned to address Grace directly, her voice taking on a tone of frank assessment. Grace, I'll be honest with you. I never thought you were the perfect match for Richard. I thought he could have done better, married someone with more social connections or family wealth. The brutal honesty was typical Maureen, but Grace appreciated the directness after a night of lies and manipulation. However, Maureen continued, you've been a loyal wife. You're carrying my first grandchild, and you've conducted yourself with dignity throughout this marriage. Richard's behavior tonight shows that he's the one who doesn't deserve you, not the other way around. Claire nearly choked on her coffee at this unexpected reversal. Even Walter looked surprised by Maureen's assessment. What changed your mind? Grace asked. The video, Maureen replied simply. Watching my son allow his mistress to throw wine at his pregnant wife while he sat there like a coward made me realize that I've failed as a mother. I raised a man who doesn't understand honor, loyalty, or basic human decency. Maureen's phone rang, and she answered with her characteristic authority. Yes, Richard. No, I will not come home and help you manage this crisis. Because you created this crisis through your own choices, the Hayes family reputation is now my priority, not your convenience. She ended the call and looked around the room with grim satisfaction. That was my son, demanding that I use my influence to fix the situation. He seems to believe that family connections can undo the consequences of his character failures. Can they? Walter asked with interest. Perhaps, Maureen admitted. I have significant social and business influence in this city. I could probably arrange some kind of damage control, smooth things over with Richard's business partners, manage the media narrative. She paused, looking directly at Grace. But I'm not going to do any of that unless Richard meets certain conditions. What conditions? Grace asked. First, he ends his relationship with that woman immediately and permanently. Second, he issues a public apology for his behavior tonight, specifically acknowledging that he failed to protect his pregnant wife. Third, he enters marriage counseling and commits to rebuilding your relationship with complete transparency. The conditions were more comprehensive than anything Grace had dared hope for, but they also revealed Maureen's primary motivation, protecting the Hayes family reputation, rather than Grace's personal happiness. And if he refuses, Grace asked, then the Hayes family cuts all ties with him, Maureen replied matter-of-factly. He loses access to family money, family connections, and family support. He can face the consequences of his choices alone. Walter nodded approvingly. Financial and social consequences tend to be very effective motivators. Exactly, Maureen agreed. Richard has always been able to rely on family resources to solve his problems. If he wants that support to continue, he'll need to prove that he deserves it. Grace felt conflicted about Maureen's proposal. Part of her was grateful for any support, especially from Richard's own family. But another part of her wondered whether she wanted a marriage that required ultimatums and external pressure to survive. Mrs. Hayes, Grace said carefully, I appreciate your support, but I need to think about what I actually want from this situation. It's not just about saving the marriage anymore. It's about whether Richard is capable of being the husband and father we need him to be. That's a fair question, Maureen acknowledged. But consider this: you're 7 months pregnant with my first grandchild. Whether or not your marriage survives, Richard will be connected to this family for the rest of that child's life. It's better for everyone if he learns to behave like a decent human being. Before Grace could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway with another update. Mr. Morrison, there's been a development. Richard Hayes is downstairs demanding to see his wife. He's agitated. How agitated? Walter asked. Hotel security is monitoring the situation, Marcus replied diplomatically. He's making threats about his legal rights and demanding access to Mrs. Hayes. Maureen's expression darkened. Bring him up. It's time Richard faced his family and explained himself. Are you sure about that? Claire asked Grace. You don't have to see him tonight if you're not ready. Grace considered the question carefully. She was emotionally and physically exhausted, but she also knew that avoiding Richard wouldn't make the situation disappear. Eventually, they would have to confront the reality of their relationship and decide how to proceed. Bring him up, Grace decided. But I want everyone to stay. I don't want to face him alone. When Richard entered the luxury suite 5 minutes later, he looked like a man whose world was collapsing around him. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes carried the desperate intensity of someone facing financial and social ruin. "Grace," he said immediately, moving toward his wife before being stopped by Walter's firm but polite intervention. "Richard," Walter said calmly, "perhaps you should begin by explaining your behavior tonight to your mother." Richard looked around the room, realizing for the first time that he was facing a unified coalition of family members rather than the individual negotiations he had been planning. "Mother," he said, turning to Maureen with relief, "thank God you're here. Walter has completely overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. We need to contain this situation before it damages the family reputation any further." Maureen studied her son with the expression of someone examining a disappointing business investment. "Richard, I watched the video of your simple misunderstanding. Explain to me why you sat motionless while your pregnant wife was publicly assaulted." Richard's composure began to crack under his mother's scrutiny. "It happened so fast," he said defensively. "I was trying to avoid escalating the situation." "You were trying to avoid choosing between your wife and your mistress?" Maureen corrected coldly. "So you chose neither, which was the worst possible decision." "Amber isn't my mistress," Richard protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's a business associate." Grace finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had endured enough lies for one evening. "Richard," she said calmly, "your business associate told me that you keep clothes in her closet and visit her apartment every Tuesday and Thursday. She knew details about our marriage, our pregnancy, and our private conversations. Stop insulting everyone's intelligence." Richard looked around the room, realizing that denial was no longer a viable strategy. The evidence was overwhelming, the consequences were mounting, and his support system was demanding accountability rather than enabling his behavior. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on the bitter tone of someone forced into an unwanted confession. "Yes, I've been seeing Amber. Yes, it's more than business. But Grace, our marriage has been difficult for months. You've been so focused on the pregnancy, so emotional and demanding. Amber understands my pressures, my needs. Soprati." The justification was exactly what Grace had expected, Richard portraying himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own choices. "So you cheated because pregnancy made me inconvenient?" Grace asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I didn't plan for it to happen," Richard continued, apparently believing that lack of premeditation somehow reduced his culpability. "Amber was there. She was supportive. She made me feel like myself again instead of just a provider for endless baby preparations." Maureen's expression grew increasingly disgusted as her son revealed the shallow selfishness that had motivated his affair. "Richard, you sound like a teenager justifying shoplifting. Take responsibility for your choices." "I am taking responsibility," Richard snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "But this nuclear response is insane. Walter has destroyed my business relationships over a personal matter. That video has been seen by everyone I work with. My investors are panicking, my clients are questioning my judgment, and my reputation is ruined." "Your reputation should be ruined," Walter said matter-of-factly. "A man who betrays his pregnant wife and allows her to be publicly humiliated doesn't deserve a good reputation." Richard turned on his father-in-law with desperate anger. "You don't understand the business implications of this situation. I have employees depending on me, projects that will fail without proper financing, commitments that require social and professional credibility. Then you should have considered those implications before you decided to have an affair," Grace said, feeling a strange sense of clarity emerging from her exhaustion and pain. "The business consequences aren't punishment for tonight's incident, Richard. They're the natural result of your character being publicly revealed." For the first time since entering the room, Richard seemed to understand that he wasn't going to be able to negotiate or manipulate his way out of the situation. The coalition against him was too strong, the evidence too clear, and the consequences too far advanced to be easily reversed. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone finally ready to face reality. "What will it take to fix this?" Grace looked at her millionaire husband, the man she had loved, married, entrusted with her future, and realized that the most important question wasn't what it would take to fix their relationship. The question was whether their relationship was worth fixing at all. By dawn Wednesday morning, Richard Clayton Hayes discovered that his business empire was built on relationships more fragile than he had ever imagined. What he had always considered his professional success was actually a complex web of social connections, personal trust, and reputation that could be unraveled with shocking speed when the foundation cracked. Grace sat in the Morrison Hotel suite, watching the sunrise through floor-to-ceiling windows, while her father updated her on the rapidly escalating consequences of the previous night's incident. Walter had spent the early morning hours fielding phone calls from business associates, all of whom had seen the viral video and were now reassessing their relationships with Richard Hayes. Harbor Point Development just canceled their partnership agreement, Walter reported, checking his messages over coffee. That was Richard's biggest project, $40 million in planned investment. Canceled completely, Grace asked, though she was beginning to understand that her father's influence network was more extensive than she had realized. The lead investor called me personally, Walter explained. He said he couldn't justify partnering with someone who demonstrated such poor judgment in personal crisis management. His exact words. Claire, who had spent the night in the suite to monitor Grace's condition, looked up from her laptop where she had been tracking the incident's coverage across social media platforms. The video has over 2 million views now. It's been picked up by national news outlets as an example of privilege and domestic indifference. The transformation of a personal humiliation into a nationwide symbol of millionaire husband entitlement was surreal for Grace. She had gone to Morrison's steakhouse for a quiet celebration with her best friend and instead become the face of pregnant women everywhere who had been betrayed by the men who were supposed to protect them. "How is Richard handling all this?" Grace asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Not well," Walter replied. "According to his office manager, he's been making increasingly desperate phone calls since 5 a.m., trying to salvage business relationships and contain the damage. Most people aren't taking his calls." Maureen Hayes arrived at the suite precisely at 8 o'clock, carrying herself with the rigid dignity of someone determined to maintain standards, even in crisis. She had clearly spent the early morning hours conducting her own damage assessment and developing a strategy for family preservation. "Grace," Maureen said without preamble, "I've spoken with Richard 3 times since last night. He's finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his errors." "Understanding and changing are different things," Grace replied, placing a protective hand on her belly where baby Charlotte was moving gently in response to her mother's voice. "Indeed they are," Maureen agreed, "which is why I've implemented certain financial consequences to ensure his understanding translates into action." Walter looked at his counterpart with professional interest. "What kind of financial consequences?" "The Hayes Family Trust Fund has very specific moral clauses," Maureen explained with grim satisfaction. "Adultery, abandonment of family responsibilities, and behavior that damages the family reputation all trigger automatic suspensions of financial support." "How much financial support are we talking about?" Claire asked. "Richard receives approximately $200,000 annually from family investments," Maureen replied. "His lifestyle, business operations, and personal expenses are built around that guaranteed income. Without it, his financial position becomes significantly more precarious." Grace began to understand why Richard had seemed so panicked during the previous night's confrontations. His apparent wealth was partially illusory, dependent on family money that could be withdrawn if he failed to meet family expectations. "There's more," Maureen continued. "The Hayes family also owns the building where Richard's office is located. His lease is due for renewal next month, and family properties have very strict moral standards for tenants." "You're evicting him from his own office?" Grace asked with surprise. "I'm requiring him to meet the same standards we apply to all tenants," Maureen corrected. "Professional behavior, ethical conduct, and reputation that reflects well on the property. He currently fails all 3 criteria," Walter nodded approvingly. "Comprehensive consequences tend to be more effective than partial ones." "However," Maureen said, turning to address Grace directly, "these consequences can be reversed if Richard demonstrates genuine rehabilitation. The question is whether you're willing to give him that opportunity." Before Grace could respond, her phone rang with a call from Dr. Patricia Santos, her obstetrician. Grace answered with some concern, wondering if the previous night's stress had created medical complications. "Grace," Dr. Santos said, I heard about the incident last night through mutual friends. How are you feeling? Any cramping, bleeding, or unusual symptoms? I feel okay, Grace replied, though she realized she hadn't been paying careful attention to her body's signals amid all the family drama. The baby has been moving normally, and I don't have any physical pain. I'd like to see you this morning for a complete checkup, Dr. Santos said. Just to be safe, extreme stress can sometimes trigger early labor, and we want to make sure everything is progressing normally. Grace agreed to the appointment, grateful for Dr. Santos's proactive concern. As she prepared to leave for the medical exam, Walter received another phone call that would further complicate Richard's rapidly deteriorating situation. Morrison, Walter answered, then listened intently for several minutes. I see. Yes, that's very interesting. Send me the documentation. When he ended the call, Walter's expression was grim but satisfied. What now? Grace asked. That was my attorney, Walter explained. Richard has been calling law firms all morning, trying to find someone willing to pursue legal action against me for business interference and conspiracy to damage his reputation. Can he do that? Claire asked with concern. He can try, Walter replied. But here's the interesting part. 3 different law firms have declined to represent him. Not because they're afraid of me, but because they've done basic research into his character and decided he's not the kind of client they want to be associated with. The revelation that even Richard's potential lawyers were distancing themselves from him demonstrated how completely his professional reputation had collapsed in less than 12 hours. One firm was quite blunt, Walter continued. They told Richard that representing a man who fails to protect his pregnant wife would be inconsistent with firm values and potentially damaging to other client relationships. Grace felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. She had never wanted to destroy Richard's career, but she was beginning to understand that his professional success had always been built on a carefully maintained facade that the previous night's incident had permanently shattered. Dr. Santos's examination 2 hours later confirmed that Grace and baby Charlotte were both healthy despite the previous night's trauma. However, the doctor expressed serious concern about Grace's stress levels and their potential impact on the remainder of her pregnancy. Everything looks good right now, Dr. Santos explained, but sustained emotional stress can cause complications as you approach your due date. You need stability, support, and peace of mind for the next 2 months. What if those things aren't possible? Grace asked. What if the stress continues because of ongoing marriage problems? Then you need to prioritize your health and your baby's health over everything else. Dr. Santos replied firmly, including your marriage, if necessary. The medical advice crystallized something Grace had been avoiding. Her relationship with Richard might not be salvageable, and continuing to fight for it might actually endanger her child's welfare. When Grace returned to Morrison's steakhouse for lunch with her father, she found him meeting with a man she didn't recognize, a distinguished gentleman in an expensive suit who carried himself with the confidence of significant authority. Grace, Walter said, standing to make introductions. This is Judge Harrison Mills. He's an old friend who wanted to meet you after hearing about last night's incident. Judge Mills extended his hand with gentle courtesy. Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry about what you experienced. No pregnant woman should ever be subjected to such treatment. Thank you, Your Honor, Grace replied, wondering why her father's friend had requested this meeting. I asked Judge Mills to join us, Walter explained, because Richard has been making threats about legal action, and I wanted you to understand your options from someone with extensive family law experience. Judge Mills nodded seriously. Mrs. Hayes, your husband's behavior last night, specifically his failure to protect you from assault, could be considered grounds for divorce in this state. More importantly, his public demonstration of poor judgment could be relevant in custody considerations. The mention of custody made Grace's hands move protectively to her belly. She hadn't considered that her marriage problems might affect her rights as a mother. What do you mean? She asked carefully. A man who allows his pregnant wife to be publicly assaulted demonstrates questionable parental judgment, Judge Mills explained. Family courts take such incidents very seriously when determining custody arrangements and parental fitness. Walter leaned forward with interest. Are you saying Richard's behavior could affect his access to his own child? I'm saying that character matters in family court, Judge Mills replied. A father who prioritizes his mistress over his pregnant wife raises questions about his ability to prioritize his child's welfare over his own desires. Grace felt overwhelmed by the legal implications being discussed. She had gone from trying to save her marriage to potentially fighting for custody of her unborn child in the span of 24 hours. "I don't want to keep Richard from his daughter," Grace said quietly. "Despite everything, he should have the opportunity to be a father." "That's very generous," Judge Mills acknowledged. "But you should also protect yourself legally, document everything, save all communications, and consider consulting with a family attorney to understand your rights." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Richard himself, who had apparently tracked Grace to the restaurant through her credit card usage. He entered Morrison's Steakhouse with the desperate confidence of someone making a final gambit, only to stop short when he realized Grace was meeting with a judge. "Grace," Richard said, approaching their table with obvious anxiety, "we need to talk privately. This situation has gone far enough." "Mr. Hayes," Judge Mills said politely, "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Judge Harrison Mills." Richard's face went pale as he recognized the name. Judge Mills was one of the most respected family court judges in the state, known for his strict standards and intolerance for domestic misconduct. "Your Honor," Richard said carefully, "I hope you understand that last night's incident has been blown completely out of proportion. A private disagreement between spouses shouldn't become a public spectacle." "A private disagreement," Judge Mills repeated with raised eyebrows. "Mr. Hayes, I've seen the video. Your wife was publicly assaulted while you sat motionless. That's not a disagreement, that's abandonment of duty." Richard's composure began to crack under judicial scrutiny. "Your Honor, surely you understand that marriage is complicated, that there are always two sides to every story." "Indeed there are," Judge Mills agreed. "However, some actions speak for themselves regardless of context. A pregnant woman being attacked while her husband fails to intervene is one of those actions." Walter watched the exchange with satisfaction, realizing that Richard was being forced to confront the legal as well as social consequences of his choices. "Richard," Grace said quietly, "Judge Mills is here as Dad's friend, not in any official capacity, but his perspective is helping me understand the full scope of what happened last night." "What happened last night was a misunderstanding that's been deliberately escalated by your father's business interference," Richard replied, his voice taking on the defensive tone that had become increasingly familiar. "What happened last night," Walter corrected, "was the public revelation of your character. Everything that's followed has been the natural consequence of that revelation." Richard turned to Judge Mills with desperate appeal. "Your Honor, surely there must be some legal recourse when a man's business reputation is destroyed through targeted harassment. Walter Morrison has used his influence to systematically damage my professional relationships." Judge Mills considered the question with judicial fairness. "Mr. Hayes, business relationships are built on trust and reputation. If your reputation was accurately rather than falsely damaged, then the business consequences are legitimate market responses rather than illegal interference. But the response has been completely disproportionate," Richard protested. "I've lost millions in potential revenue over a single incident. A single incident that revealed fundamental character flaws," Judge Mills replied. "The business community has simply decided that your character doesn't meet their standards for partnership. That's their right." Grace watched her millionaire husband argue with a judge about the fairness of facing consequences for his actions, and she realized that Richard had never truly understood the concept of accountability. His wealth and social position had always insulated him from serious repercussions, leaving him unable to process a situation where his choices had permanent, unavoidable consequences. "Richard," Grace said, finding her voice amid the legal and business discussions, "stop fighting the consequences and start thinking about what kind of man you want to be going forward. Our daughter's going to be born in 2 months. What kind of father do you want her to have?" The mention of their daughter seemed to penetrate Richard's defensive anger, and for a moment his expression softened with something that might have been genuine remorse. "Grace," he said quietly, "I know I made mistakes, but if we could just move past this, start over, focus on our family." "Moving past this isn't possible," Grace replied. "The video exists, the business damage is done, and everyone knows what kind of man you are. The only question now is whether you're willing to become a better man." Richard looked around the table at his estranged wife, her protective father, and a judge who represented the legal system's standards for acceptable behavior. He was facing a coalition of people who demanded accountability rather than excuses, character rather than convenience. "What would it take?" he asked finally. "What would I have to do to prove that I can be better?" Grace felt her heart break a little at the question, because it revealed how completely Richard had misunderstood the situation. He was still thinking in terms of performance and negotiation, rather than genuine transformation. "Richard," she said gently, "you can't prove you're a better man. You have to actually become one, and that's something only you can decide to do." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Morrison's steakhouse. Dorothy Mae Morrison, Grace's mother and Walter's ex-wife, arrived precisely at 9 o'clock with the determined expression of a woman who had spent the night making difficult decisions about family loyalty and maternal protection. Grace hadn't seen her parents in the same room for nearly 6 years, not since their bitter divorce had split the family into opposing camps. But the sight of her wine-stained daughter on viral video had apparently overridden Dorothy's long-standing grievances against her ex-husband. "Grace, sweetheart," Dorothy said, immediately enveloping her pregnant daughter in a fierce maternal hug. "I came as soon as Claire called me. Are you all right? Is the baby all right?" "We're both okay, Mom," Grace replied, feeling like a child again in her mother's protective embrace. "It was just horrible. So public and humiliating." Dorothy pulled back to examine her daughter's face with the clinical attention of someone assessing emotional damage. "You look tired, stressed. Have you been sleeping, eating properly?" "She's been staying here at the hotel," Walter interjected, approaching his ex-wife with the careful courtesy of two people navigating complicated history. "Full room service, medical monitoring, everything she needs." Dorothy turned to acknowledge Walter for the first time, her expression complex with old pain and current gratitude. "Walter, thank you for taking care of her. She's my daughter, too," Walter replied simply. "Our daughter." The emphasis on shared parenthood wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Despite their personal conflicts, Walter and Dorothy had created something beautiful together, Grace and the grandchild she carried. "I saw the video," Dorothy continued, her voice hardening with maternal fury. "I saw that woman throw wine at my pregnant daughter while her husband sat there like a statue. I've never been so angry in my life." "Join the club," Walter said grimly. "Richard's discovering that actions have consequences." Dorothy studied her ex-husband with newfound respect. "I heard about the business consequences. The restaurant blacklisting, the canceled partnerships, the investment withdrawals. Very thorough." "I protect my family," Walter replied. "Always have." The conversation carried undertones of their old marriage, Walter's fierce protectiveness that Dorothy had found both comforting and overwhelming, the intensity that had both attracted and exhausted her during their 25 years together. "Grace," Dorothy said, settling into a chair beside her daughter, "I need to tell you something. I've been in contact with Richard's mother." Grace's eyes widened with surprise. "You talked to Maureen?" "3 times since last night," Dorothy confirmed. "We may not agree on much, but we both have a grandchild to consider. Maureen is, not pleased with her son's behavior." Walter looked intrigued by this development. "What kind of collaboration are we talking about? The kind where two mothers put aside their differences to protect a pregnant woman and her unborn child?" Dorothy replied firmly. "Maureen has resources. I have perspective. And together we can ensure that Grace and the baby are protected regardless of what happens with the marriage." Grace felt overwhelmed by the sudden alliance forming around her. People who had spent years avoiding each other were now coordinating their efforts to shield her from the consequences of Richard's choices. "What does that mean practically?" Grace asked. "It means you have options," Dorothy explained. "Maureen is prepared to ensure financial security for you and the baby. Whether or not you stay married to Richard, I'm prepared to provide emotional and practical support. Your father is handling social and business protection." "And Richard?" Grace asked. "Richard gets to decide whether he wants to be part of this family support system or outside of it," Walter replied. "But either way, you and Charlotte are protected." The conversation was interrupted by Claire's arrival with legal documents and a grim expression. "Grace, you need to see this. Richard filed for emergency custody of the baby this morning." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. "Emergency custody. The baby isn't even born yet. He's claiming that your father's business interference has created emotional instability that could endanger the pregnancy, Claire explained, reading from the legal filing. He wants court-ordered restrictions on Walter's contact with you and mandatory family counseling for you both. Dorothy's face flushed with indignant rage. He allows his mistress to assault his pregnant wife, then claims she's emotionally unstable. The audacity is breathtaking. Walter's expression turned dangerously calm. Richard is trying to use the legal system to regain control after losing everything else. Classic abuser tactics. I'm not unstable, Grace said, her voice growing stronger with defensive anger. I'm stressed because my millionaire husband betrayed me and allowed his mistress to humiliate me in public. That's a rational response to an irrational situation. Of course it is, Dorothy soothed. Any reasonable person would be upset by such treatment. Judge Milne, who had remained at the restaurant to observe the family dynamics, spoke up from his position at a nearby table. Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Hayes's emergency filing is legally frivolous and ethically questionable. No judge will grant custody restrictions based on these circumstances. Why is he doing this? Grace asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Desperation, Walter replied. Richard has lost his business relationships, his family support, and his social standing. The only leverage he has left is the threat of legal action regarding his child. It's also distraction, Judge Mills added. By filing custody motions, he shifts the narrative from his misconduct to your alleged instability. It's a common strategy among men facing consequences for domestic abandonment. Grace felt the baby kick strongly, as though responding to the stress and anger surrounding the discussion of her future welfare. The child wasn't even born yet, and she was already being used as a pawn in her parents' deteriorating relationship. I won't let him do this, Grace said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. I won't let Richard use our daughter as a weapon to avoid accountability for his choices. What do you want to do? Dorothy asked gently. I want to meet with him, Grace decided, face to face, with witnesses, and give him one final opportunity to choose between being a real husband and father or being completely removed from our lives. Walter looked concerned. Grace, are you sure you're ready for that kind of confrontation? I'm ready for resolution, Grace replied. One way or another, this situation needs to end. Our daughter deserves to be born into clarity rather than chaos. Maureen Hayes arrived at the restaurant an hour later. Having been summoned by Dorothy for their unprecedented collaboration, the two mothers approached each other with the wary respect of former adversaries united by common purpose. Dorothy, Maureen said with formal courtesy, thank you for calling me. Maureen, Dorothy replied, our children have created a situation that requires adult supervision. The understatement was deliberate and effective. Both women understood that their offspring had failed to handle their relationship responsibly, necessitating parental intervention to protect the innocent grandchild caught in the middle. I've reviewed Richard's legal filing, Maureen said, her voice tight with disapproval. It's embarrassing, vindictive, and completely counterproductive to his stated goal of family reconciliation. He's trying to intimidate Grace into compliance, Dorothy observed. Make her afraid of losing custody so she'll accept his infidelity and abuse. Over my dead body, Maureen replied with surprising vehemence. The Hayes family does not engage in legal intimidation of pregnant women. Richard has crossed a line that I will not tolerate. Grace watched her mother and mother-in-law coordinate their opposition to Richard's legal strategy, marveling at how quickly former strangers could become allies when facing a common threat to someone they both loved. What's your plan? Grace asked. Simple, Maureen replied. We're calling Richard's bluff. I've retained the best family law attorney in the state to represent you, at family expense. We're going to show him that his legal threats are not only baseless, but actively harmful to his own position. More importantly, Dorothy added, we're documenting everything, every threat, every manipulation, every attempt to use the baby as leverage. If this goes to court, the judge will see exactly what kind of man Richard really is. Walter nodded approvingly. Comprehensive documentation tends to be very persuasive in legal proceedings. There's something else, Maureen continued. I've spoken with Richard's business partners about the emergency custody filing, They're concerned about his judgment and emotional stability. Concerned how, Grace asked. Concerned enough to accelerate their withdrawal from professional relationships, Maureen explained. A man who files frivolous custody motions against his pregnant wife while his business empire collapses is not someone they want to be associated with. Grace realized that Richard's legal strategy was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of intimidating her into submission, he was providing additional evidence of his poor judgment to an ever-widening circle of people who influenced his professional and social standing. He's destroying himself, Grace observed sadly. He's making choices, Walter corrected. Bad choices with predictable consequences. We're just ensuring that those consequences are complete rather than partial. Dorothy reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand. Grace, you need to understand something. Whatever happens with Richard, you and that baby will be protected. You have resources, support, and family who love you. Don't let fear of the unknown keep you trapped in a situation that's clearly harmful. I know, Grace replied, feeling stronger and more confident than she had since the wine hit her face 2 nights ago. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm angry, and I'm determined to do what's best for Charlotte, even if that means ending my marriage. The declaration marked a turning point in Grace's emotional journey from victim to survivor to someone actively taking control of her own destiny. Around the table, the unlikely alliance of her divorced parents and estranged mother-in-law nodded with approval and determination. Richard Hayes was about to discover that attacking a pregnant woman surrounded by people who loved her was the worst strategic decision he could have made. At 2:30 in the morning on Friday, Grace Morrison Hayes went into labor. The contractions began as she was reading Richard's latest legal filing, a document so vindictive and desperate that even his own attorney had reportedly advised against submitting it. The irony wasn't lost on her that the stress of her millionaire husband's continued attacks on her character was potentially triggering the early arrival of their daughter. Dad, Grace called from her suite at the Morrison Hotel, doubling over as another contraction hit with surprising intensity. I think it's time. Walter appeared in her doorway within seconds, already reaching for his phone to call 911. Behind him, Claire emerged from the guest bedroom, where she had been staying to monitor Grace's condition. How far apart are the contractions? Claire asked, immediately switching into crisis management mode. 3 minutes, Grace gasped, gripping the back of a chair as another wave of pain rolled through her body. They started about 20 minutes ago, but they're getting stronger fast. Walter was already coordinating with emergency services while simultaneously calling Grace's obstetrician. The efficiency of his response reminded Grace why he had been so successful in business when crisis struck. Walter Morrison took immediate, comprehensive action. Ambulance is on the way, Walter reported. Dr. Santos is meeting us at the hospital. Everything's going to be fine. Sweetheart. As they waited for the ambulance, Grace found herself thinking about how different this moment was from what she had imagined during her pregnancy. She had envisioned Richard holding her hand, coaching her through contractions, sharing the excitement and terror of their child's arrival. Instead, her father and best friend were her support system, while her millionaire husband was presumably asleep in the house she no longer considered home. Should we call Richard? Claire asked gently, voicing the question Grace had been avoiding. Grace considered this as another contraction, peaked and subsided. Call him, she decided. Whatever else he is, he's her father. He should have the chance to be there for her birth. Walter made the call while they traveled to the hospital, reaching Richard's voicemail and leaving a terse message. Grace is in labor. St. Mary's Hospital. If you want to meet your daughter, be there. By the time they reached the hospital, Grace's labor was progressing rapidly. Dr. Santos confirmed that baby Charlotte was eager to meet the world, arriving 3 weeks early but apparently healthy and strong. Everything looks good, Dr. Santos assured Grace as they prepared for delivery. She's a bit early, but her heart rate is strong and she seems ready for this journey. The delivery room filled with supportive voices, Walter holding his daughter's hand, Claire documenting every moment with photos, Dorothy arriving just in time after driving through the night, and even Maureen Hayes appearing with flowers and fierce grandmother determination. Richard arrived 20 minutes before Charlotte was born, disheveled and obviously awakened from sleep by Walter's message. He entered the delivery room tentatively, unsure of his welcome after days of legal threats and emotional manipulation. "Grace," he said quietly, approaching her bedside with unexpected humility. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm about to have a baby," Grace replied, managing a small smile despite the pain. "Your daughter apparently decided she didn't want to wait any longer." For a moment, Richard's face showed genuine emotion, wonder, fear, and something that might have been love for the child they had created together. It was the first authentic expression Grace had seen from him since the night at Morrison's steakhouse. "I'm sorry," Richard said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as everyone else in the room. "For everything. For Amber. For that night. For the legal filing. I've been, I've been trying to win instead of trying to be better." Grace looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw exhaustion, regret, and the beginning of self-awareness that might eventually lead to genuine change. "Richard," she said gently, "we can talk about all of that later. Right now, let's just focus on welcoming our daughter safely into the world." Charlotte Morrison Hayes was born at 4:17 a.m., weighing 6 pounds and 2 ounces, with her grandfather's determined chin and her mother's gentle eyes. When Dr. Santos placed the tiny, perfect baby on Grace's chest, the delivery room fell silent with the awe that accompanies new life. "Hello, Charlotte," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her daughter for the first time. "Welcome to your complicated but loving family." Walter stood beside the bed, tears flowing freely as he met his first grandchild. "She's beautiful. Grace, absolutely perfect." Richard approached cautiously, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. May I hold her?" Grace nodded, carefully transferring Charlotte to her father's arms. Richard held his daughter with the reverent care of someone holding something infinitely precious and fragile. "Hi, baby girl," Richard whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm your daddy, and I promise I'm going to figure out how to be worthy of you." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Vernon Sterling, who had driven through the night after hearing about Grace's labor from Maureen Hayes. The mechanic carried a handmade wooden cradle and an expression of deep remorse. "Mrs. Hayes," Vernon said quietly, "I wanted to bring this for the baby. I made it myself, as an apology for my daughter's behavior. It's not enough, but it's something." Grace was touched by Vernon's gesture, especially the obvious craftsmanship and care that had gone into creating the beautiful cradle. "Mr. Sterling, that's incredibly kind. Thank you." Vernon looked at Richard holding baby Charlotte, and his expression grew serious. "Mr. Hayes, I hope you understand what a gift you've been given. That little girl deserves a father who puts her welfare above everything else." "I'm beginning to understand that," Richard replied, never taking his eyes off his daughter's face. Over the next several hours, the hospital room became a gathering place for the extended families and friends who had rallied around Grace during her crisis. Dorothy and Walter worked together to coordinate visitors and manage logistics, their shared concern for their daughter and granddaughter overriding years of post-divorce awkwardness. Maureen Hayes took charge of media management, ensuring that news of Charlotte's birth remained private despite the continued public interest in the wine-throwing incident. Judge Mills stopped by to congratulate the family and quietly inform Richard that his emergency custody filing had been withdrawn by his attorney as not in the client's best interests. As evening approached and visiting hours ended, Grace found herself alone with Richard and baby Charlotte for the first time since their daughter's birth. The silence was comfortable rather than tense, filled with the gentle sounds of a newborn baby discovering the world. "Grace," Richard said finally, "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I've destroyed your trust and hurt you in ways that can't be easily forgiven. But I want to try to be better. For Charlotte, and for you, if you'll let me." Grace studied her millionaire husband, seeing vulnerability and genuine remorse that had been absent during his previous attempts at reconciliation. "Richard," she said carefully, "wanting to be better and actually becoming better are different things. Charlotte and I need to see actions, not just words." "What kind of actions?" Richard asked. "Real therapy, not just marriage counseling for show. Complete transparency about your finances, your business, your relationships, and time to prove that the man I fell in love with is still in there somewhere, underneath the person you became." Richard nodded seriously. What about us? What about our marriage? Grace looked down at Charlotte, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and realized that her priorities had crystallized completely during the labor and delivery. Our marriage is going to be whatever we make it, Grace replied. But my first priority is raising our daughter in an environment where she learns that she deserves to be treated with respect, loyalty, and love. If you can be part of creating that environment, then we'll figure out the rest as we go. And if I can't, Richard asked quietly, then Charlotte and I will create that environment without you, Grace said firmly. I won't let her grow up thinking that love means accepting betrayal or that marriage means sacrificing dignity. Richard absorbed this ultimatum without defensiveness or anger, seeming to understand that Grace was offering him an opportunity rather than making threats. I understand, he said. And Grace, thank you for giving me the chance to be Charlotte's father, even after everything I've done. 3 months later, Grace sat in Morrison's steakhouse with baby Charlotte sleeping in her carrier, watching her father train new servers in the art of hospitality excellence. The restaurant had become Charlotte's second home, with Walter's staff competing to spoil their boss's granddaughter and Grace finding peace in the familiar surroundings where her family's healing had begun. Richard had kept his promises about therapy and transparency, working with counselors to understand the selfishness and entitlement that had nearly destroyed his family. Their marriage remained a work in progress, built on careful trust and daily choices, rather than romantic assumptions about unconditional love. She's going to be spoiled rotten, Claire observed, watching Walter carry Charlotte around the dining room like a trophy while she slept peacefully in his arms. By everyone except me, Grace laughed. Someone has to teach her that the world doesn't revolve around her, even if Grandpa Walter thinks it should. The wine-throwing incident had faded from viral status, though it occasionally resurfaced as an example of public accountability in the social media age. Richard's business had eventually stabilized at a smaller scale, built on genuine relationships rather than reputation management. Amber Sterling had indeed returned to Millerville with her father, where she worked in Vernon's garage and slowly learned the difference between attention and respect. Most importantly, Charlotte Morrison Hayes was growing up surrounded by people who demonstrated through their actions what love, loyalty, and family really meant. She would learn from her grandfather Walter that protecting family was a man's highest calling, from her grandmother Dorothy that forgiveness was possible but not automatic, and from her mother that dignity was never negotiable. As for Richard, he was learning daily that being Charlotte's father was both his greatest privilege and his most demanding responsibility. Every choice he made was now measured against a simple question. What kind of man do I want my daughter to see when she looks at her father? The answer to that question was still being written, one day at a time, in the careful rebuilding of a family that had been broken by betrayal, but strengthened by the fierce love of people who refused to let a precious child grow up without knowing exactly how much she was worth. Grace looked down at her sleeping daughter and realized that the wine-throwing incident, as painful as it had been, had ultimately given Charlotte the most valuable gift possible, a family that would fight for her, protect her, and show her through their actions what she deserved from the world. Sometimes the worst moments in life created the foundation for the best ones to follow, and sometimes public humiliation was actually the beginning of private redemption. In the end, Charlotte Morrison Hayes would grow up knowing that she was loved fiercely, protected completely, and valued beyond measure by every adult in her life. And that knowledge would be worth all the wine-stained dresses and viral videos in the world.